everybody? My name is Tony Ortiz. I'm going to try to be doing this on a semi-regular basis here. This is my normal modern day for streaming, but what I'm doing is I'm just going to talk about, since there was a big modern tournament last weekend, or whenever there's basically any kind of modern event going on, like a Grand Prix, Pro Tour, obviously, um, first Pro Tour of the calendar year. Each year is supposed to be modern now. Whenever there's a big modern event, Modern Masters set comes out, something like that, I'm going to try to do the first few minutes of the week on my thoughts on what's going on, or if there's any kind of big modern event coming up, what I think about that event, what you should expect to see, what you might want to consider about the format before you're going into the event. So, real quick, let's just get it out of the way. Ali Antrazi qualifies for the Star City Games Players Invitational Championship at the end of the year with his win in the first ever Modern and Standard Invitational event. I really didn't think that any of the top eights were going to be the undercard formats, but in this top eight, it just so happened that Modern was going to be the format that gets played. So I expect how it to go is I can't recall whether or not the first Invitational's top eight was Legacy or Standard. I think it was Standard. So what I expect to happen is probably the next Invitational that's Legacy, the top eight will probably be Legacy, and then the final Invitational of the year, it'll probably be Standard because this Modern and Standard Invitational was Modern top eight. I assume that's what they're probably going to do. They'll have the four invitational events each year. They'll have two standard top eights, one at each, and then the other events will be the other format top eight. So that's kind of actually not a bad way to do it. You're mixing around. All the formats get their time to shine. Standard's the most popular and the most profitable, so it's going to get one extra go around. But yeah, Ali won it with Tron. His list is pretty close to my list. Not a whole lot of changes. Just a couple of quick footnotes. What I really liked that he did, I liked that he ran a second Crucible Worlds. It really helped him out. I think in a lot of the harder matchups where opponents are going to have Ghost Quarters and Tech Edges, usually they bring that in and they don't think that they need to bring in Artifact Tape because they're going to be messing with your lands. Well, Crucible is a great way to punish them for that. It even if it doesn't get on the board, it's a shield for something else that you're gonna need to keep. So pretty awesome card. Glad that he put in a couple into his sideboard. If you watch my video from last week, you can get an idea of the merits and flaws I think to the card. How I really like to have at least one in my sideboard. Two if you can find room for it is really cool. So I mean he just played excellently. In the final match, what I didn't expect to happen was that he won 3-0 against Bloom. Bloom's not a great matchup. It's not any by means one of your top three worst matchups because you're kind of almost trying to do the same thing that they're doing. The problem is that they have a lot more ways to be redundant that you don't have. The only real edge you have in the matchup is that your sideboard has a lot of things that can screw with them, and their sideboard doesn't have a lot of things that can screw with you. That's probably the best part about it. Tron, I think, in that matchup against Bloom is probably not as big of a dog as people think it is. I think it's more of like a 6-4 and not necessarily a 7-3. Basically meaning if you play 10 matches, this is how many matches you probably expect to win, boarded or not. But man, he really did a great job of playing. He only made a few mistakes in that final round, and I'm not even really going to go over them just because his opponent, Chris Van Meter, actually made a couple more mistakes than he did. And I think that both players are excellent players. The issue here was that they were both probably piloting decks that they didn't really have as much time to practice with as you would expect someone to be practicing with to make no mistakes whatsoever. I think that Van Meter, if he plays this same setup again at the next Modern Invitational, he'll make even less mistakes, and Antrazi, same thing. The other top 8 match with Tron, we didn't get to see because it was off camera, but there is another match from Ali's quarterfinal match. You get to see that. He played really excellently in that match too. Excuse me. So this one was a little bit different. He had to fight off a lot more disruption early, but he didn't have to fight off. Oh, actually, wait, no, they showed it. Oh yeah, so you get to see his semifinal match and his Yeah, what they did was they played two quarterfinals at the same time, and they played the other two quarterfinals at the same time. So they played both Tron matches at the same time. So you get to see the first round match, and they played each semifinal. So you got to see his semifinal against Jund, and then you got to see the final. So semifinal against Jund, that's what I'm talking about. He made actually a lot less mistakes in that matchup than he made in the final. Um, Jund is a really good matchup for Tron though, because a lot of their main deck spells they just don't do anything against the deck. Um, if fair decks like Jund are going to be popular in your format, Tron's usually a pretty good metagame call. We've been over this. He didn't make any really mistakes that I could see that were like game costing. There was a couple just really good plays that were made on the other side of the table that he really just couldn't do anything about. But then you want to go back to the quarterfinal matchup. He played against Merfolk, which is one of those really awkward matches. You're not really 100% sure if it's good or bad. It's really good game one, but it's kind of like every game in Modern. Their best hand beats your best hand, usually. But all of your mediocre hands beat all of their mediocre hands. So that's where the matchup gets a little tricky. And Merfolk isn't a deck you're going to see a lot of, and you're also not going to see a lot of it played well. So it's very hard to be practiced against that matchup. I think he handled it pretty well. He was helped out. There were a couple really good plays by his opponent and a couple huge misplays. Um, so I also don't like the way his opponent sideboarded Merfolk, but I won't get into that too much. You do have to be wary of Spreading Seas. Spreading Seas is probably one of the better aura-based land hosers, just because it replaces itself. It's much better than the black one. It's much better than the green one. But at the same time, blue really can't afford to put, especially Merfolk with all the blue mana symbols, can't really afford to put in the stuff that really messes with you, like Tech Edge and Ghost Quarter. So, I mean, it's actually ends up being a better matchup post board than you'd think it would be. Uh, any aggro deck is going to be a bad matchup for Tron, even though the possibility of turn 3 Karn is always there. It's because Karn doesn't really deal with multiple creatures on the board all that well. So you're basically just trying to survive in a lot of scenarios. And a lot of times aggro decks will draw fast enough to just make you have to have a big answer like O-Stone, Ugin, etc. So no matter how you slice it, the deck was piloted excellently, but the real reason it won wasn't the pilot and it wasn't the deck. It was the game around the deck. This kind of ties into what I think is going to happen this weekend. There's no way Tron can have a prayer at even making a top 8. If it goes into a tournament, it has to play more than 10 rounds, and the meta around it is full of mediocre matchups. The deck's just not consistent enough. I love it to death, but with all of the Abzan and Jund running around and these new versions of Delver that are going into a lot more cards that are not focused around the combo, like Tarmogoyf and Kolaghan's Command and things like that, a lot of these decks playing less of their threats, which is huge for Tron because, you can remove the first few. They were getting less redundant and trying to fan out more to handle more of their bad matchups across the field. All these combo strategies that you're really soft to, with them having their sideboards more fanned out and more focused on decks that aren't Tron, with them having their main decks more so that aren't focused on not playing against Tron, you really have an opening there in the metagame to try to just dive in and cash in on one major event. If you're a legacy player, this is usually how people who play Reanimator get big tournament wins. Graveyard decks always fall out of favor because there's so much good graveyard hate against graveyards. Even in Modern, this is the case a lot of times. And what happens is people will start hedging their bets on shaving graveyard hate cards to try to deal with more decks that they're going to see more often with their sideboard. And what happens is, a graveyard players, you can jump in when the graveyard decks are at their thinnest, when there's not many people playing them, you can jump in and you can steal tournaments with them. And I shouldn't say steal because you still have to play extremely well to win any tournament that size, but it's a metagame call. The problem with Tron winning this week is that it really hoses its chance at winning or this coming week in Charlotte, because people are going to start sideboarding Sowing Salt. There's nothing you can do about it. it doesn't matter that all the top pros or the best players or even the best grinders out on the GP circuit know that Sowing Salt is way too narrow of a card to play in your sideboard. It's also too expensive. It's actually probably one of the worst cards you could sideboard because of how narrow it is. It's 2 red mana symbols. For those of you who don't know what it does, it's 2 red and 2 colorless. It's originally from Urza's Destiny, I believe, where they printed a 5-color cycle of these cards. And what all these cards do is they destroy something or they counter something, and then they surgical extraction that card from your opponent's deck, library, and hand. So what a Sowing Salt does is it destroys a non-basic land, and then it searches the opponent's deck, hand, and library for all copies of that, and then it exiles them, which is really, really. There's really no way to win around that in Tron unless you can just draw all your lands and then cast your stuff hard cast. It's very hard to win around that card. However, since most decks have some option of land destruction anyway, Ghost Quarter, Tech Edge, a couple other things out there, the far better play, the far better card to run in this case is Surgical Extraction. Surgical Extraction is 1 Phyrexian black mana. Therefore, you don't even have to run it in black decks. You can just pay 2 life. Often you're going to pay 2 life and cast it for free. Anything you destroy that hits the opponent's graveyard is able to be surgical. The only disadvantage that Surgical Extraction has over Sowing Salt is that it doesn't also destroy the land. You're doing 2 cards for the same effect. However, Surgical Extraction has a much broader use in many more matchups than just against Tron or maybe, say, Amulet Bloom, where you blow up a Simic Growth Chamber or something. That card can stop all kinds of problematic spells that get cast on you once. It can interfere with Snapcaster Mages at instant speed. It can strip discard from your opponent's hand. Like if you get Thoughtseize turn 1 and then you have a Surgical and they either have to take their Surgical and lose all their Thoughtseizes and let you combo off. It's just a great sideboard card if it's all over the place. I used to sideboard them in my deck quite a bit, especially when I couldn't find things like Spellskite and Ugins when I was building this deck on paper, and I still sideboard them online sometimes. It depends on the metagame. So there's much better options than Sowing Salt. However, you got to remember that a Grand Prix draws a lot more than the top players. It's not an invitational event. It's not a small event. It's huge. You're going to have to wade through a field of hundreds of players, maybe even 1,000. Who knows? And those players are always going to go with more narrow strategies in a big tournament because that's what they do with their F&M or their weekly Modern event, and that's what might work for them there. Even though that's not necessarily going to work for them in this Grand Prix, they don't play in enough Grand Prix, or they don't listen to the advice of people who play in enough Grand Prix to know that a card like that's too narrow. So you're going to see Sowing Salt. Maybe not as a 4 of on the sideboard, but enough to where Tron's not going to be able to go X and 2 or X and 3, whatever it's going to require to get to top 8. Then when you factor in that Twin is so well positioned, and then more people are going to be going to this Grand Prix than went to anything last weekend because it's a Grand Prix, you're going to see way more Twin. You're going to see a lot of people, I think, back off of the Grixis Twin model or the Teamer Twin model, and they're going to go back to the good old solid red-blue Pro Tour winning Twin, the control deck that combos you deck. It's the most consistent deck. It's the most solid deck in the format. It's if you want to have the best game 1 against the rest of the field, it's got it. If you want to have probably the 3rd or 4th best sideboard in terms of the toolbox you have, it's got that. It's in colors to where it can screw with its mirror as well, especially out of the sideboard. If you're confident in your ability to play Magic, you probably want to take in regular blue-red twin into this tournament. I think a regular blue-red twin deck is going to win this tournament. I would probably say the odds are probably only about 2 to 1 on twin winning the tournament. Everything else I think is at least 4 to 1 or worse. So I don't think Collected Company has a place in the format right now. It's just too slow. It doesn't impact the board enough for 4 mana even at instant speed, considering you usually don't even ramp into it. The key is what's the best deck that's going to be positioned to win? Twin, which is an awful matchup for Tron. And how much hate is there going to be for Tron at that tournament? There's going to be more hate for Tron than there should be because of how well it did. And not just the Invitational, but the Modern event that went along, the open event that went along with it, which was also won by Tron. And then if you even further rewind it to a week ago into the modern week of Standard Super League, you had both Tron decks win their first match. They had to play each other, and then Owen won it with that Tron deck, and he did it with a very unconventional build as well. So not only I think are you going to see all this hate, not only do you think you're going to see a better representation of the best decks, you're also going to see a whole format tournament of Modern and not half Standard and half Modern where it doesn't take it as many wins. And you're also going to see people playing, if they do play Tron, I think they're going to be playing less than optimal versions of the deck based on what they've seen over the last 2 weeks. Because this deck is very much like Bloom. It's not a bandwagon deck. This is not a deck you buy the cards for, you sleeve up, you play, and you win tournaments with. It takes a lot of practice. There's a lot of complex interactions. You don't turn 3 your opponent very often. There's a lot of things you have to make. It's like playing chess. You have to be 5, 6, 7 moves ahead of your opponent, and it doesn't have a backup plan. There is no backup plan in this deck other than hope to play lands and your opponent drawing nothing and play your spells for their full mana cost, which is not a very good backup plan. Decks like Bloom are more complicated. They're a little harder to play. Better game ones, better win rates, and they have backup plans. They have other ways to win the game. So for all those reasons, I don't think you're going to see Tron do a whole lot this week at a Grand Prix. And, that's just the life of a Tron player. You're never going to really be well positioned to win a tournament unless you know the metagame is going to be so not ready for this deck that you can steal a good majority of your wins. So with that all said,